The concrete was unforgiving beneath my wheels as I landed another failed kickflip, the sound echoing through the empty skate park like a gunshot. 8 months. That's how long my father had been sitting in federal prison while I perfected tricks that would never pay a single bill. Pulled out my phone to check the time and saw Brandon's face filling the screen on the local news app. There he was, my golden boy brother, standing outside the Dallas County Courthouse in his $1,000 suit, talking about justice being served and how no one is above the law, not even family. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, Tyler Thompson, the 32-year-old disappointment, watching my Harvard MBA brother celebrate putting our father away for tax evasion, while I couldn't even land a basic trick I'd been doing since I was 16. Typical, I muttered, shoving the phone back into my ripped jeans pocket. The thing about being the family screw-up is that people stop expecting anything from you pretty early on. I remember the exact moment it happened. I was 14, showing Dad this painting I'd spent weeks working on, a cityscape of downtown Dallas with all these intricate details. Brandon was there too, fresh off winning some academic award. Dad barely glanced at my canvas before saying, "Tyler, you need to understand something. Art doesn't pay the bills. Your brother here is going places. He'd paused, looking at me like I was a math problem he couldn't solve. "You'll never amount to anything if you keep chasing these fantasies." Brandon had just stood there, smirking. That was 18 years ago, and honestly, nothing much had changed. Brandon went on to graduate summa cum laude from Harvard Business School, while I dropped out of community college to pursue what Dad called my skateboard dreams. He'd been right about one thing. I never did make real money from skating. I taught kids at the local park for cash, did some street art commissions, lived in a studio apartment that cost more than it was worth. But here's the thing nobody understood. I'd chosen this life because it was mine. Every scraped knee, every failed trick, every disappointed look from Dad, it was all mine. I owned my failures in a way Brandon never owned his successes. And right now, watching him on that courthouse step, something inside me snapped. Dad might be a lot of things. Cold, demanding, impossible to please. But he wasn't a criminal. I'd grown up in that house. I'd seen how meticulous he was about everything, especially his business. The man organized his sock drawer by color and fabric type. He wasn't the kind of person who would mess around with the IRS, which meant someone else was. I grabbed my board and headed home, my mind racing faster than my wheels on the pavement. Everyone expected me to do nothing, to keep being the family disappointment, while Brandon liquidated Dad's empire piece by piece. After all, what could a skateboard-riding, paint-covered loser possibly do against a Harvard-educated businessman with teams of lawyers? That night, sitting in my cramped apartment with takeout containers scattered around my computer, I started Googling things I'd never cared about before. Tax evasion, federal charges, IRS document requirements, how to prove innocence in white-collar crime. It was overwhelming. Every article was full of legal jargon that might as well have been written in ancient Greek. I didn't understand half the words, let alone the concepts behind them, but I kept reading, because here's what Brandon didn't know about his failure of a little brother. I might not have his fancy education, but I had something he'd never understand. When you've spent your whole life being underestimated, you learn to see things differently. You notice details other people miss. You find ways to solve problems that don't fit into neat, corporate boxes. Brandon thought he was playing chess while I was playing checkers. What he didn't realize was that I wasn't playing either game. I was about to invent my own rules. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in over 2 years. I called the federal prison where they were holding Dad. After 20 minutes of being transferred between departments, finally got through. "Robert Thompson isn't accepting calls from family members," the guard told me. "Tell him it's Tyler," I said. "Tell him I know he didn't do it." There was a long pause. "Hold on." 5 minutes later, "He said to tell you that you're wasting your time. Said you should focus on your own life." Even from prison, Dad was still writing me off. I hung up and stared at my reflection in the black screen of my phone. Stubbled face, paint under my fingernails, wearing the same torn Vans I'd had for 3 years. Everything about me screamed failure, perfect. Because if I was going to take down Brandon and his team of corporate sharks, being underestimated wasn't just an advantage, it was my secret weapon. I picked up my skateboard and headed for the door. Time to prove that sometimes the biggest disappointment in the family tree can grow into something nobody saw coming. After all, how hard could it be for a 32-year-old skateboarder to take down a Harvard MBA and save a $200 million empire? One trick at a time. 3 days into my investigation, I realized I was completely screwed. I'd been sitting at my laptop for hours, trying to understand what amended tax returns meant, when my eyes started crossing. Every article about federal tax evasion might as well have been written in Mandarin. Words like depreciation schedules and offshore asset allocation swam around my screen like angry wasps. Meanwhile, Brandon was making moves that actually mattered. I'd driven past Thompson Industries that morning, Dad's 40-story glass monument to success in downtown Dallas, and watched a parade of moving trucks hauling away office furniture. Through my cracked phone screen, I could see the local business news reporting that interim CEO Brandon Thompson continues strategic restructuring of the family empire. Strategic restructuring. That was a fancy way of saying he was selling everything that wasn't nailed down. While I was Googling, how does the IRS work, like some middle school kid doing homework, Brandon was liquidating assets with the efficiency of a corporate shark. He had teams of lawyers, accountants, and advisors helping him dismantle 20 years of Dad's work, piece by profitable piece. And what did I have? Skateboard and a burning conviction that something wasn't right. I was about to give up for the day when I remembered the Riverside underpass where I'd been working on a mural last month. There was this older woman who'd stopped to watch me paint. Said she liked my use of color and perspective. We'd gotten to talking, and it turned out she was a retired lawyer named Mel, who lived in the neighborhood. Mel Rodriguez, sharp as a tack, probably in her 60s, with silver hair and eyes that didn't miss anything. She'd mentioned she specialized in white-collar defense before she retired. What did I have to lose? I found her 2 hours later at the same spot, sitting on a bench and reading the Dallas Morning News. She looked up when my skateboard wheels announced my arrival. Tyler, right? The artist? Yeah, that's me. I sat down next to her, suddenly feeling ridiculous. Listen, this might sound crazy, but I need help with something legal. Mel folded her newspaper and studied my face. What kind of legal trouble are you in? It's not me. It's my father. He's in federal prison for tax evasion, but I think he was framed. She raised an eyebrow. That's a serious accusation. What makes you think that? Because I know him. Yeah, he's demanding and perfectionist, but he's not stupid. He's been running a clean business for 30 years. This doesn't make sense. Sense and evidence are two different things, Mel said carefully. What kind of evidence are we talking about? I pulled out my phone and showed her the news articles about the case. As she read, I watched her expression change from polite interest to genuine concern. Your father is Robert Thompson, the real estate mogul. You know him? I know his reputation. And you're right. This doesn't fit his profile. She handed back my phone. Tyler, federal tax evasion cases don't just appear out of nowhere. Someone had to provide evidence to the IRS. Someone with access to financial records. The implication hit me like a truck. Brandon, I whispered. I didn't say that, Mel said quickly. But if you're serious about investigating this, you need to understand what you're up against. Federal cases are built on documentation, paper trails, digital records, things that require expertise to analyze properly. Will you help me? Mel was quiet for a long moment, watching kids play basketball in the court across from us. Tyler, I'm 73 years old. I retired because I was tired of fighting battles that destroyed families. My heart sank. But, she continued, I've also seen what happens when innocent people get railroaded by the system. And if there's even a chance your father is innocent, she turned to look at me directly. I'll teach you what you need to know. But this isn't going to be easy. Are you prepared to learn things that might be boring, complicated, and completely outside your comfort zone? I thought about Dad sitting in his federal prison cell, probably wondering why none of his sons were fighting for him. I thought about Brandon's smug face on the courthouse steps. I thought about 18 years of being told I'd never amount to anything. I'm a fast learner when I want to be. Mel smiled for the first time since I'd sat down. Good, because we're going to start with the basics. How much do you know about corporate tax structure? Absolutely nothing. Perfect. That means you don't have any bad habits to unlearn. She stood up and brushed off her pants. Meet me at the downtown library tomorrow at 10. Bring a notebook and prepare to have your mind melted. As I skated home that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. For the first time since Dad's arrest, I had a plan that went beyond just believing in his innocence. But when I got back to my apartment, I found a surprise waiting for me. Sitting on my kitchen counter was my old company keycard, the one I'd forgotten to return when Dad officially wrote me off from the business 2 years ago. Thompson Industries, executive level access. Tyler Thompson. I stared at the plastic card, my pulse quickening. Brandon was so busy playing CEO that he'd probably never thought to deactivate my access. Why would he? I was just the family screw-up who'd never shown any interest in the business anyway. The irony was almost funny. In his arrogance, Brandon had left me the perfect way to get inside the very building where he was orchestrating Dad's downfall. I tucked the keycard into my wallet and grabbed my laptop. Tomorrow, Mel would teach me how to understand the game Brandon was playing. But tonight, I was going to figure out how to get inside and see what cards he was holding. The Thompson Industries building looked different at 2 a.m. Without the usual army of suits and briefcases, the 40 floors of glass and steel felt like a tomb. I stood across the street, hood up, skateboard under my arm, trying to work up the courage to swipe that keycard. 3 weeks had passed since my crash course with Mel began. My brain was still reeling from terms like accelerated depreciation and phantom income, but I was starting to understand the language of corporate finance. More importantly, I was beginning to see how someone could manipulate the numbers to make an innocent man look guilty. But understanding. The theory and proving it were two completely different things. Dad had stopped accepting my calls entirely. The prison guard told me he'd requested to be placed on a no-contact list for all family members. According to my research, that usually meant an inmate had given up hope. Meanwhile, Brandon was moving faster than ever. Just yesterday, he'd announced the sale of 3 major properties, including the downtown office complex where Dad had his first big success, liquidating non-core assets to preserve shareholder value, the press release had said. Translation: Brandon was gutting the empire before anyone could stop him. I checked my watch. The night security guard would be making his rounds on the upper floors right about now. I'd spent enough time in this building as a kid to know the patterns. 20 minutes on floors 30-40, then back down to the lobby, time to move. My key card worked on the first try. The elevator ride to the 35th floor felt like the longest 60 seconds of my life. Every camera, every sensor, every beat made my heart pound harder. But the card still had executive access, which meant I could go anywhere in the building without triggering additional security protocols. Brandon's new office, Dad's old office, was at the end of the hall. Corner suite, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Dallas. I'd only been in there a handful of times, usually when Dad was lecturing me about living up to my potential. The door was locked, but the executive key card opened it without hesitation. The office had changed. Dad's conservative leather furniture was gone, replaced by Brandon's modern, minimalist aesthetic. The family photos had been removed from the desk, along with Dad's collection of small sculptures from his business trips. It was like someone had surgically removed every trace of Robert Thompson from his own company. I started with the desk drawers, not really knowing what I was looking for. Financial documents, emails, anything that might explain how Dad had supposedly hidden millions from the IRS. But Brandon wasn't stupid enough to leave smoking guns lying. Around then I remembered what Mel had taught me about white-collar investigations. The real evidence is usually in the trash. People throw away drafts, notes, documents they think are unimportant. But mistakes live in garbage cans. The office trash was empty, cleaned by the night crew. But the building had a central waste collection area in the basement, where everything got sorted before pickup. I'd helped Dad with a Bring Your Kid to Work Day tour down there once, back when I was 12 and still believed he might be proud of me someday. The basement was exactly as I remembered. Concrete walls, fluorescent lighting, and the persistent smell of industrial cleaning supplies. The waste sorting area was behind a chain-link fence, but my keycard worked there too. I found the executive floor garbage bags and started digging. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Coffee cups, food containers, standard office waste. But in the third bag I found something interesting. A stack of papers from Brandon's office, all shredded except for one document that had somehow escaped the paper shredder. It was a photocopy of a tax document with Dad's signature at the bottom. But something about it looked wrong. The signature was too perfect, too clean. Dad's real signature was messier, more hurried. I'd seen it thousands of times on birthday cards and school permission slips. This looked like someone had traced it. I stuffed the document into my jacket pocket and kept searching. 20 minutes later, I found something even better. A handwritten note in Brandon's precise penmanship. Schedule meeting with Morrison. Need final numbers for IRS submission. Make sure everything matches the amended returns. Morrison. I knew that name. He was the company's head accountant, a nervous little man who'd worked for Dad for over 15 years. If Brandon was coordinating IRS submissions with Morrison, that meant they were working together. My phone buzzed with a text from Rico, one of my skating buddies. Dude, you good? So you're light on at 3 a.m. I checked the time. I'd been in the building for over an hour. The security guard would be making another round soon. I grabbed one more bag and rifled through it quickly. More standard garbage, but at the bottom, I found something that made my blood run cold. A business card for a private investigator named Janet Wu, with a handwritten note on the back. Background check complete. No criminal history. Minimal assets, consider non-threat. They'd investigated me. Brandon knew I was sniffing around. I pocketed everything I'd found and made my way back to the elevator. As the doors closed, I heard footsteps echoing in the hallway, the security guard starting his rounds. Back on the street, I leaned against my skateboard and tried to process what I'd discovered. I had evidence that Brandon was coordinating with the company accountant on IRS matters. I had what looked like a forged signature, and I had proof that they considered me enough of a threat to run a background check. But was it enough? Mel had drilled into me that federal cases required overwhelming evidence. Few documents from a trash can wouldn't be enough to free Dad or stop Brandon's liquidation plans. I needed more, and I needed help. That's when I remembered something else Mel had told me. White-collar crimes are rarely committed in isolation. There's usually a network of people involved, each playing a small part. Find the network, and you find the truth. Rico worked nights as a security guard at a downtown office building. My friend Jake from the skate park was some kind of computer whiz who made money fixing laptops and phones. There was Rosa, the elderly woman who did bookkeeping for small businesses in my neighborhood. None of them were professionals. None of them had fancy degrees or corporate experience. But they were people Brandon would never suspect. People who understood how to stay invisible, how to notice things others missed, how to work around systems instead of through them. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, I smiled. Brandon thought he was playing chess while I was playing checkers, but what he didn't realize was that I was building my own team. And sometimes the people no one takes seriously are the ones who see everything. You want me to do what? Jake Martinez looked at me like I'd asked him to hack into NASA. We were sitting in his cluttered apartment above a pawn shop on Elm Street, surrounded by disassembled computers and the smell of energy drinks. I need you to recover deleted emails from a corporate server, I repeated. It's not as crazy as it sounds. Dude, that's literally as crazy as it sounds. Jake pushed his thick glasses up his nose and leaned back in his gaming chair. We're talking about federal crimes here. Your brother could have us all arrested. My brother already had me investigated, I said, pulling out the private investigator's business card I'd found in his trash. He knows we're looking into this. Jake studied the card, his expression shifting from skepticism to curiosity. At 26, he was 6 years younger than me, but infinitely more tech-savvy. I'd met him at a skating competition 2 years ago, where he'd been live-streaming the event for a local sponsor. We'd bonded over our shared status as disappointments to our families. His parents had wanted him to be a doctor. Not a freelance computer repair guy, okay, But even if I could access their email server, which I'm not saying I can, what makes you think there's anything incriminating there? I spread out the documents I'd found in Brandon's trash, the forged signature, the handwritten note about IRS submissions, Morrison's business card, because my brother's too arrogant to think anyone would look. He's been sloppy. Jake picked up the paper with the suspicious signature and held it up to the light. This does look weird. The ink density is too consistent. Exactly. And that's just what I found in one night of dumpster diving. This is insane, Jake muttered, but I could see the wheels turning in his head. If I did this, and I'm not saying I will, I'd need physical access to their network. You can't just hack into a major corporation from your laptop. I still have building access. Of course you do. He laughed despite himself. Tyler, you realize this is the most irresponsible thing either of us has ever considered doing? Yeah, you in? Jake stared at the documents for another long moment. My cousin got screwed by a corporate lawsuit 3 years ago. Lost his house, his savings, everything because some rich guys decided to throw him under the bus. He looked up at me. When do we start? An hour later, we were at Rosa Delgado's kitchen table in her modest house in Oak Cliff. Rosa was 71 years old and had been doing bookkeeping for small businesses since before computers existed. I'd met her through my landlord, who'd mentioned she was sharp as a tack with numbers. Mijo, she said, pouring coffee into mismatched mugs. You're telling me your brother forged tax documents to send your father to prison? That's what I think happened. But I need someone who understands financial records to help me prove it. Rosa had been studying the papers I'd brought, her weathered hands moving carefully over each document. She'd put on reading glasses and was making notes in a small notebook with handwriting so neat it looked like calligraphy. This signature, she said finally, pointing to the suspicious document. I've seen your father's real signature on checks when he used to donate to my church. This isn't right. Can you prove it? Maybe, but I'd need to see more documents. Real ones and fake ones so I can compare them properly. She looked up at me over her glasses. This is dangerous, Tyler. If your brother finds out we're investigating him, he already knows, I said, showing her the private investigator's card. The question is whether we're going to let him get away with it. Rosa was quiet for a long moment, sipping her coffee and staring out her kitchen window at the small garden where she grew tomatoes and peppers. My husband died 10 years ago, she said finally. Lung cancer. The insurance company tried to deny his claim, said his condition was pre-existing. They had lawyers, money, all the advantages. She turned back to me, but they didn't have the truth. And sometimes, mijo, that's enough. By the time I met Mel at the downtown library the next morning, I had assembled the most unlikely investigative team in Dallas history. A retired white-collar defense attorney, a freelance computer technician, and an elderly bookkeeper. You realize this could backfire spectacularly, Mel said when I explained my plan. If Brandon catches wind of what we're doing, he could have us all charged with corporate espionage. But if we don't try, Dad dies in prison and Brandon gets away with stealing $200 million. Mel opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. I've been doing my own research on your father's case. There are inconsistencies in the prosecution's timeline that bothered me. She spread out photocopies of court documents, news articles, and financial reports. According to the IRS, your father has been systematically underreporting income for 3 years. But look at this, she pointed to a series of bank statements. These deposits match perfectly with reported real estate transactions. If he was hiding money, where is it? The prosecution claims there are offshore accounts, but they've never produced evidence of them. Because they don't exist, I said. Exactly. Which means someone created fake documentation to make it look like your father was evading taxes. Mel leaned back in her chair. The question is how they did it and how we prove it. That afternoon, Jake and I returned to Thompson Industries. This time I went in through the front door like I belonged there. While Jake posed as a computer repair technician, I'd hired to upgrade my workstation. The beauty of having executive access was that nobody questioned what I was doing there. The few employees who recognized me just assumed Brandon had brought me back into the family business. Jake worked quickly, connecting a small device to the network hub in my old office, while I kept watch in the hallway. In 15 minutes, he'd gained access to the company's email system. "I'm in," he whispered, downloading thousands of messages onto an encrypted drive. "But Tyler, some of these emails are recent." "Yesterday recent. What do they say?" Jake's face went pale as he read from his laptop screen. "There's a message from Brandon to someone called MR. That's probably Morrison, the accountant you mentioned. It says move timeline up. Need to complete liquidation before any questions arise." My blood ran cold. He knows we're investigating. There's more. Another message to someone at a law firm. Prepare defense strategy for potential challenges to father's conviction. Anticipate claims of evidence tampering. I stared at the screen, feeling sick. Brandon wasn't just covering his tracks. He was preparing for the possibility that someone might uncover the truth. "How long do we have?" I asked. "According to this, he's planning to sell the last major properties within 2 weeks. After that, most of the money will be transferred to accounts we can't trace." Jake disconnected his equipment, and we left the building as quickly as possible. Back in his apartment, we spread out everything we'd discovered. The forged signature, the financial inconsistencies Mel had found, the emails proving Brandon was accelerating his timeline. "It's not enough," I said, staring at the evidence. "A decent lawyer could explain all of this away." That's when Jake pulled out one more thing, a USB drive he'd been hiding in his pocket. "I found something else on their server," he said quietly. "An audio file buried in Morrison's personal folder. It's labeled insurance policy." He plugged the drive into his computer and hit play. Brandon's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. "Morrison, I need you to understand something. If this ever comes back to bite us, you're the one who prepared these documents. As far as anyone knows, I had nothing to do with the tax modifications." Morrison's nervous reply. "But Mr. Thompson, what if your father's lawyers start asking questions?" "My father doesn't have lawyers anymore. He fired them when he realized he couldn't afford to fight a federal case." Brandon's voice was cold, calculating. "By the time anyone figures out what really happened, the money will be long gone." I sat back in my chair, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. My brother hadn't just framed our father. He'd planned it all along. Morrison's audio recording changed everything. We spent the next 3 days dissecting every email Jake had pulled from the Thompson Industries server. Rosa spread financial documents across her kitchen table like she was solving a jigsaw puzzle, while Mel cross-referenced legal filings with dates on the recovered communications. I was learning to see patterns I'd never noticed before, numbers that didn't add up, timelines that were too convenient. Most importantly, I was developing something I'd never had before: focus. "Tyler, look at this," Rosa called from her kitchen table where she'd been analyzing bank statements for hours. "These deposits to your father's business account, they happen every month like clockwork. But here," she pointed to a series of highlighted entries, "someone made manual adjustments 3 days after each deposit." "What kind of adjustments?" "Someone was moving money around, making it look like the amounts were different than what actually came in. Small amounts, maybe 5% each time. But over 3 years, she did quick calculations on her notepad. That's over $8 million. Mel looked up from her legal documents. $8 million that would show up as unreported income to the IRS. But where did the money actually go? I asked. Rosa smiled grimly. That's the brilliant part. It never left your father's accounts. Someone just made it look like it did by creating false entries in the books. Jake pulled up the recovered emails on his laptop. I found the how. Brandon was sending Morrison instructions every month. Adjust Q3 entries per our discussion. Use standard variance protocols. Standard variance protocols, Mel repeated. That's accounting speak for make the numbers look different than they really are. The scope of Brandon's planning was becoming clear. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a systematic, long-term operation designed to build a case against Dad while positioning Brandon to take control of the company. But as impressive as our progress was, Brandon was moving faster. That morning's Dallas Business Journal had announced the sale of Thompson Industries' crown jewel, the Preston Center development that had made Dad's reputation. $75 million sold to a company I'd never heard of. Brennan Holdings, Jake read from his computer screen. Incorporated in Delaware 6 months ago. No previous business history. Shell company, Mel said immediately. He's selling the assets to himself through a fake corporation. My phone buzzed with a news alert. Thompson Industries CEO announces completion of restructuring plan. The article quoted Brandon saying the company had successfully navigated the challenges presented by recent family difficulties. Like Dad rotting in federal prison was just an inconvenience. I was learning something else about myself during those long days of investigation. I was angrier than I'd ever been in my life. But instead of the unfocused rage that had driven my teenage years, this was cold, calculated fury. The kind that builds strategies instead of throwing punches. The kind that plans. We need to move faster, I told the team. Rosa, how long to document all the financial irregularities? 2 days, maybe 3 if I'm being thorough. Jake, can you trace where the money from these shell company sales is actually going? Already on it. Give me 48 hours. Mel, what do we need to get Dad's case reopened? She closed her law books and looked at me seriously. Evidence of prosecutorial misconduct or fraud. What we have so far is strong, but we need something that directly links Brandon to falsifying the IRS documents. That evening, I was skating through downtown Dallas when I realized something that had been bothering me for days. Dad had always been paranoid about keeping backup copies of important documents. Every contract, every financial statement, every piece of correspondence. He kept duplicates in a safe deposit box at First National Bank. Brandon would have access to those records as interim CEO, but only if he knew about the box. Dad had never told him about it. He'd only mentioned it to me once, years ago, when he was explaining why I needed to be more careful with important papers. Adults keep backups of everything important. Tyler, someday you'll understand why. At the time, I'd thought it was just another lecture about responsibility. Now I realized it might be the key to everything. The next morning, I met Mel at the bank. As Dad's son, I had legitimate access to visit him in prison and get authorization to access the safe deposit box for legal research purposes. It took 3 hours of paperwork and 2 calls to the federal prison, but eventually Dad agreed to authorize access. The guard who delivered the message told me Dad had asked why I was still wasting time on this. Even from prison, he was protecting me, or trying to. The safe deposit box contained exactly what I'd hoped, copies of every major financial transaction Thompson Industries had made in the past 5 years. Real copies with original signatures and unaltered numbers. Rosa nearly cried when she saw them. Tyler, these show the actual revenue numbers. The real numbers before anyone made adjustments. She spread the documents across Mel's dining room table, comparing them to the falsified records we'd recovered from Brandon's emails. It's systematic fraud, Mel said, studying the evidence. Brandon and Morrison didn't just hide money. They created an entirely false financial history for your father's company. Jake was taking photographs of every document, building a digital archive of evidence. This is enough to get your dad out of prison, he said. More than enough. But as I stared at the proof of my brother's betrayal, I felt something unexpected. Sadness. For 32 years, I'd believed I was the disappointment. The son who couldn't live up to Dad's expectations. The failure who would never amount to anything. Brandon had been the golden boy. Harvard MBA, perfect grades, corporate success. Everything Dad had wanted in a son. And it was all a lie. Brandon wasn't the successful son who'd made Dad proud. He was a criminal who'd systematically destroyed the man who'd given him everything. The real tragedy wasn't that Dad had misjudged me. It was that he'd trusted the wrong son completely. Tyler? Mel's voice brought me back to the present. Are you ready to take this to the FBI? I looked at our evidence. Financial records, audio recordings, email communications, testimony from 3 credible witnesses. Everything we needed to prove Dad's innocence and expose Brandon's crimes. Yeah, I said. Let's bring my brother down. I found Brandon at the Dallas Country Club, having lunch with his Harvard Business School buddies on the terrace overlooking the golf course. He was wearing a charcoal Armani suit that probably cost more than my rent, laughing at some joke while cutting into a $40 steak. The image of success. The golden son who'd made all the right choices. I walked up to his table wearing ripped jeans, paint-stained Vans, and a decade-old skateboard t-shirt. Every head turned as I approached, conversations stopping mid-sentence. "Tyler," Brandon said, his smile freezing in place. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk. I'm having lunch with clients. This isn't appropriate. Neither is framing our father for tax evasion." I pulled out a chair and sat down uninvited. "But here we are." Brandon's lunch companions shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a guy in an expensive watch, started to excuse himself. "No, stay," I said pleasantly. "You should hear this. It's about corporate ethics and family values." "Right up your alley." Brandon's face had gone pale, but he kept his voice level. "Gentlemen, would you mind giving my brother and me a moment?" After they left, Brandon leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a whisper. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" "Learning. Rosa taught me about financial fraud. Jake showed me how to recover deleted emails. Mel explained prosecutorial evidence requirements." I pulled out my phone and showed him a photo of Morrison's audio recording. "Want to hear yourself planning Dad's downfall?" For the first time in my life, I watched my perfect brother lose his composure. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched into fists, and something dark flickered behind his eyes. "You have no idea what you're messing with," he said. "I know you've been systematically stealing from Dad's company for 3 years. I know you forged tax documents to make it look like he was hiding income. I know you bribed Morrison to create false records." I leaned back in my chair. "What I don't know is why." Brandon straightened his tie, trying to regain control. "Tyler, you're clearly in over your head. Whatever conspiracy theories you've concocted, $8 million in falsified revenue adjustments. Shell companies in Delaware, audio recordings of you threatening Morrison." I counted off on my fingers. "Those aren't theories, Brandon. They're federal crimes." He stared at me for a long moment, then started laughing. Actually laughing. "You think you've figured it all out? Tyler, the family screw-up, is going to take down his successful brother?" He shook his head. "Do you have any idea how this looks? A 32-year-old skateboarder with a community college dropout record accusing a Harvard MBA of financial fraud? Pretty good, actually. Especially when the skateboarder has evidence and the MBA has a motive." "What motive?" "You couldn't stand sharing the inheritance. You've been planning to eliminate Dad from the business since you graduated. The only problem was he'd never retire willingly, so you had to find another way." Brandon's mask slipped completely. The charming smile disappeared, replaced by cold calculation. "You want to know the truth, Tyler? Fine. Dad was never going to leave that company to anyone but himself. He was 73 years old, holding on to control like a drowning man. The business was stagnating under his leadership, so you decided to frame him. I decided to accelerate the inevitable transition. Dad's methods were outdated. His vision was limited. Under my leadership, Thompson Industries could expand nationally, internationally." Brandon leaned forward. "I was saving the company by destroying our father, by removing an obstacle to progress." His voice was matter-of-fact, like we were discussing quarterly earnings. "Dad would have run that company into the ground within 5 years. I preserved $200 million in assets. For yourself, for the future of the business." I stared at my brother, finally understanding what I was dealing with. This wasn't about money or business strategy. Brandon genuinely believed he was justified. In his mind, framing Dad was a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of corporate efficiency. "What about the audio recording, Brandon? Morrison's testimony? The falsified financial records? Morrison is a nervous man who will say whatever keeps him out of prison. Audio recordings can be edited. Financial discrepancies happen in complex corporations." Brandon adjusted his cufflinks. "Do you really think a jury will believe your word over mine?" He was right, and we both knew it. Even with all our evidence, a good lawyer could create reasonable doubt. Brandon had Harvard credentials, corporate experience, and the presumption of respectability. I had a skateboard and 3 unconventional allies. But that's when I realized something Brandon had missed in all his careful planning. "You're absolutely right," I said, standing up. "A jury probably would believe you over me. Harvard MBA versus community college dropout. Successful businessman versus family disappointment." Brandon smiled, thinking he'd won. "But here's what you didn't consider," I continued. I don't need a jury to believe me. I just need the FBI to investigate. And when they start digging into your shell companies, your falsified records, your coordination with Morrison, I shrugged. Well, federal investigators are pretty thorough. Brandon's smile faltered. You see, the beautiful thing about being underestimated is that people don't take precautions against you. They don't expect the family screw-up to understand corporate fraud or gather evidence or build a case. I picked up my skateboard. They certainly don't expect him to have copies of every original document from Dad's safe deposit box. That's impossible. Dad never told you about the first national safe deposit box? Box 1247? The one with backup copies of every major transaction since 2019? I watched the color drain from Brandon's face. Turns out Dad did trust me with something important after all. Brandon stood up abruptly, knocking over his water glass. Tyler, you don't understand the consequences of what you're doing. If you move forward with this, it'll destroy the family, the business, everything Dad built. Dad built a legitimate company. You turned it into a criminal enterprise. I started walking away, then turned back. Oh, and Brandon? You should probably call your lawyer. You're going to need one. As I skateboarded away from the country club, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Complete certainty that I was doing the right thing. For 32 years, I'd been trying to prove I was worthy of Dad's respect. Now I knew I already was. I sat in my apartment that night, staring at the evidence spread across my coffee table. Financial records, audio recordings, email communications. Everything needed to destroy Brandon and free Dad. Everything except the certainty that I wanted to use it. For the first time in 8 months, I had real power. Not the kind that comes from money or education or family connections, but the power that comes from holding the truth. Brandon's entire life was in my hands, and he knew it. The question was, what did I want to do with that power? My phone had been ringing all evening. First Brandon, calling from different numbers when I blocked him. Then unknown numbers, probably his lawyers or private investigators. I'd turned it off an hour ago, but I could still see the notification light blinking through the case. 32 years of being dismissed, overlooked, written off as the family failure. 32 years of watching Brandon collect every accolade, every moment of pride, every ounce of Dad's respect that should have been shared between us. Part of me wanted to let Dad rot in prison. Let him understand what it felt like to be abandoned by the son he'd trusted. Let him discover that his golden boy was a criminal, while his disappointment was the only one who cared enough to fight for the truth. That would be justice, wouldn't it? Around midnight, Mel knocked on my door. I let her in without a word, gesturing toward the evidence that covered every surface of my small living room. Jake told me about your confrontation with Brandon today, she said, settling into my only decent chair. How are you holding up? I don't know if I want to save him. Mel nodded like she'd been expecting this. Your father? He never believed in me, not once. Even when I was little, trying so hard to make him proud, he'd find something wrong with everything I did. I picked up one of the financial documents, Dad's signature clear and confident at the bottom. Brandon was always the one with potential. Brandon was the future of the family. I was just there. And now you have the power to prove him wrong, or to prove him right. I set the document down carefully. What kind of son am I if I let my father suffer in prison because my feelings are hurt? Mel was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. Tyler, can I tell you about a case I worked on 15 years ago? I nodded. I had a client whose business partner had embezzled money and framed him for the crime. Just like your situation. My client was innocent, but he'd spent 2 years in prison before we could prove it. What happened? We got him out. Charges dropped, reputation restored, everything. But you know what he told me afterward? Mel leaned forward. He said those 2 years in prison taught him more about himself than the previous 50 years of freedom. He learned who his real friends were. He learned what actually mattered. He learned to forgive people who'd let him down. Are you saying Dad deserves to be in prison? I'm saying maybe this isn't about what your father deserves. Maybe it's about who you want to be. After Mel left, I called Jake and Rosa. They came over with coffee and donuts from the 24-hour shop on Elm Street, settling into my small space like we'd been meeting this way for years instead of weeks. So, what's the plan? Jake asked, booting up his laptop. That depends. Are we doing this to save Dad or to destroy Brandon? Rosa looked at me over her reading glasses. Mijo, those are the same thing, are they? Because right now I have enough evidence to free Dad and send Brandon to prison. But I also have enough evidence to just walk away, let the system handle it, let Dad figure out his own problems. You're angry, Jake said. It wasn't a question, I'm furious. But not just at Brandon, at Dad too. For 32 years of making me feel like I wasn't good enough. For choosing Brandon over me every single time. I gestured at the evidence around us. Even now, even after everything we've discovered, part of me thinks Dad deserves this for being such a terrible judge of character. Rosa set down her coffee and looked at me seriously. Tyler, let me ask you something. If your father had been the perfect parent, if he'd supported your art and believed in your potential and treated you fairly, would you still want to save him? Of course. Then the question isn't whether he deserves to be saved. The question is whether you're the kind of person who does the right thing, even when it's hard. Jake pulled up the timeline we'd created of Brandon's crimes. Look at this from another angle. If we don't act, Brandon gets away with stealing $200 million. He'll do it again to someone else's family. And your father dies in prison for crimes he didn't commit, Rosa added. Maybe he wasn't perfect, but he doesn't deserve that. I stared at our evidence board. Photos, documents, timelines, connections drawn in different colored markers. Weeks of work by 4 people who barely knew each other 6 months ago. There's something else, I said quietly. If we do this, if we go to the FBI, everything changes. Dad gets out, but he'll know that I was the one who saved him. The family failure he never believed in became the son who fought for him when everyone else gave up. And that scares you? Mel had returned, letting herself in with the key I'd given her. It changes everything. Suddenly, I'm not the disappointment anymore. I'm the hero. Dad will want a relationship with me, probably offer me a job, try to make up for 32 years of emotional neglect. I looked around at my small apartment, my simple life. What if I like being underestimated? What if I don't want his approval anymore? Jake laughed. Dude, you've been investigating corporate fraud for 2 months. You clearly want something. I want justice. I want Brandon to pay for what he did. I want Dad to understand that he was wrong about both of us. I picked up Morrison's audio recording, but I also want to be sure I'm doing this for the right reasons. Rosa stood up and walked to my window, looking out at the Dallas skyline. Mijo, I've been watching you these past weeks. You've learned things that would challenge people with PhDs. You've organized a team, gathered evidence, confronted your brother, risked your safety. She turned back to me. You think that's what a failure does? I think that's what someone does when they finally find something worth fighting for. Exactly. So the question isn't whether your father deserves to be saved. The question is whether justice deserves to be served. I looked around at these 3 people who'd become my unlikely family. Mel, who'd risked her reputation to help a stranger. Jake, who'd committed federal crimes to recover evidence. Rosa, who'd spent her retirement analyzing financial fraud instead of tending her garden. They'd all chosen to do the right thing, even when it was dangerous, even when it was hard. All right, I said, reaching for my phone. Let's call the FBI. Special Agent Sarah Chen looked like she could bench press my skateboard without breaking a sweat. She sat across from me in the FBI's Dallas field office, studying the evidence we'd brought with the intensity of someone who'd seen every kind of corporate fraud imaginable. This is impressive work, she said, holding up Morrison's audio recording. How exactly did you obtain this? It was on the company server, Jake answered carefully. I had authorized access as a contractor. Agent Chen's eyebrow went up, but she didn't pursue it. Mr. Thompson, your brother has significant legal representation. Are you prepared for the kind of legal battle this will create? Brandon's been preparing for a legal battle since he started stealing from Dad's company, I said. The difference is, now he's fighting the federal government instead of a family he thought would never fight back. 3 hours later, we walked out of the FBI building with the knowledge that Brandon Thompson was about to have the worst day of his life. Agent Chen had been thorough. She'd examined every document, listened to every recording, and questioned each member of our team separately. By the end, she was making phone calls to coordinate with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Federal Financial Crimes Task Force will execute search warrants tomorrow morning, she'd told us. Mr. Thompson, you should probably prepare for significant media attention. I hadn't thought about that part. My phone started ringing before we reached the parking garage. Local news stations, somehow already aware that Robert Thompson's case was being reopened. Jake grabbed my phone and turned it off. Dude, you're about to be famous. The skateboard-riding son who saved his millionaire father from prison. Great. That's exactly what I wanted. But Rosa was smiling as we walked to our cars. Mijo, sometimes the story writes itself. And this one? This one's going to inspire people. The next morning, I watched from across the street as FBI agents carried boxes of evidence out of Thompson Industries. Brandon was led away in handcuffs at 7:43 a.m., and the local news was streaming it live. My phone had exploded with messages from reporters, but I wasn't ready to talk to anyone yet. Instead, I sat in my apartment, watching the coverage and trying to process what we'd accomplished. By noon, the story had gone national. Corporate executive arrested in elaborate frame-up of father. CNN was calling. A stunning reversal in a case that highlights the complexity of white-collar crime in America. But the part that really got me was when they interviewed one of Dad's former employees, a woman named Janet, who'd worked as his assistant for 15 years. Mr. Robert Thompson was demanding. Sure, but he was honest, she told the reporter. He never asked anyone to do anything questionable. When Brandon took over, things changed. People started getting fired for asking questions. At 2 p.m., Agent Chen called with an update. Morrison is cooperating fully. We've recovered financial records dating back 4 years that show systematic falsification of your father's tax documents. Her voice was professional but satisfied. Your brother's lawyers are already talking plea bargains. What about Dad? Emergency hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning. Based on the evidence of prosecutorial misconduct, I'd say he'll be released pending a full review of his case. I hung up and stared at my reflection in the black screen of my phone. Tomorrow, Dad would be free. Brandon would be facing 20 years in federal prison, and I would have to figure out what came next. That evening, Mel, Jake, and Rosa came over with takeout and beer. We sat around my coffee table, which was finally clear of evidence for the first time in weeks. So what happens now? Jake asked. You're about to be rich and famous. Dad's empire gets restored. Brother goes to prison. You become the heir to $200 million. I don't want to be rich and famous. Too late, Rosa said, showing me her phone. You're trending on Twitter. Skateboard justice is apparently a thing now? I looked at the hashtag. Thousands of people posting about underdogs fighting back against corruption. About family members who refuse to give up. About the importance of truth over appearances. This is insane. This is America, Mel corrected. People love a good David and Goliath story. And you just took down Harvard MBA with a skateboard and 3 senior citizens. Hey, Jake protested. I'm only 26, Rosa laughed. Mijo, you helped expose one of the biggest corporate fraud cases in Texas history. That's not insane. That's justice. My phone rang. The caller ID showed Texas Federal Prison. Dad. I stared at the screen for 3 rings before answering. Tyler? His voice was hoarse, tired, but unmistakably relieved. Yeah, Dad, it's me. They told me. They said you're the one who found the evidence. That you've been working for months to prove my innocence. We had help. A lot of help. There was a long silence. Then, Tyler, I owe you an apology. Several apologies. 32 years worth. Dad, no, let me say this. I was wrong about you. Wrong about Brandon. Wrong about what matters. His voice broke slightly. My son saved me. The son I never believed in became the man I needed him to be. I looked around at Mel, Jake, and Rosa, all pretending not to listen to my conversation. I didn't do it for you. Dad, I did it because it was right. I know. And that's why I'm proud of you. For 32 years, I'd wanted to hear those words. Now that I had, they felt different than I'd expected. Not like validation I'd been seeking, but like recognition of something I'd already become. I'll see you tomorrow at the hearing, I said. Tyler, thank you. For everything. After I hung up, Rosa reached over and patted my hand. How does it feel, mijo? Being the hero. I thought about it for a moment. It feels like I finally know who I am. 6 months later, I sat in a federal courtroom watching my brother receive a 20-year sentence for conspiracy, fraud, and money laundering. Brandon looked smaller in his orange jumpsuit. The confident Harvard MBA who'd dismissed me at the country club was gone, replaced by a man who'd lost everything that defined him. His lawyers had tried every angle: plea bargains, cooperation deals, character witnesses, but the evidence was overwhelming. Judge Martinez read the sentence without emotion. "Mr. Thompson, your systematic fraud not only damaged your father's reputation, but undermined public trust in our financial institutions. The court sentences you to 20 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release." Brandon's shoulders sagged. He didn't look back at the gallery where I sat with Mel, Jake, and Rosa. His wife had filed for divorce 3 months ago. His business contacts had evaporated. Even his Harvard friends had distanced themselves once the full scope of his crimes became public. The empire he'd stolen was being returned, piece by piece, to its rightful owner. Dad had been released the day after our FBI meeting. The charges against him were formally dismissed when Morrison's cooperation revealed the full extent of the document falsification. The U.S. Attorney's Office issued a public apology, acknowledging that prosecutorial resources had been misdirected based on fabricated evidence. But Dad's real vindication came from something else entirely: Thompson Industries, under court-supervised restoration, was thriving. The employees Brandon had fired were rehired. The properties sold to shell companies were being recovered. Most importantly, Dad had announced his retirement and the appointment of a new CEO. Me. "I still can't believe you said yes," Jake whispered as we left the courthouse. "I still can't believe he asked." I replied. The conversation had happened 3 weeks ago, in Dad's study where I'd spent so many childhood moments trying to earn his approval. "Tyler, I want you to run the company," he'd said without preamble. "Dad, I don't know anything about real estate development. You know about honesty. You know about fighting for what's right. You know about building teams and solving problems." He gestured around the room. "Those are the things that matter. What about my art? My skateboarding? All the things you said were worthless?" Dad had smiled sadly. "I was wrong about a lot of things, but maybe we can find a way to combine your creativity with business acumen. Maybe Thompson Industries needs an artist's perspective." The transition hadn't been easy. I'd spent months in crash courses on real estate law, project management, and corporate governance, but I'd also brought my own approach to the family business. We were now funding public art projects in every development. Skate parks were included in our residential designs. Employee benefits included tuition support for community college and trade schools. Not just 4-year universities. Thompson Industries, building communities. Not just properties had become our new slogan. Rosa had been hired as our chief financial oversight officer, a position created specifically for her after she'd caught 3 accounting irregularities in our books during her first week. Jake ran our new cybersecurity department, implementing systems that made our digital infrastructure virtually bulletproof. Mel had come out of retirement to serve as our general counsel, bringing decades of white-collar defense experience to our legal compliance team. The skateboard kid who'd never amounted to anything was now running a company worth $200 million, employing over 400 people, and developing projects across 3 states. But the most satisfying moment came at our first shareholders meeting, when Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who'd lost her retirement savings in Brandon's shell company schemes, stood up during the public comment period. "I want to thank the new management of Thompson Industries," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "They didn't have to help people like me recover our losses, but they did. They created a victim compensation fund from their own profits. Dad had initiated the fund, but I'd designed its implementation. Every person Brandon had defrauded through his fake companies received full restitution, plus interest." After the meeting, Dad and I stood on the balcony of his office, my office now, looking out over downtown Dallas. "Any regrets?" he asked. "About Brandon? About the investigation? About taking over the company? About any of it. I thought about my old life, the simple apartment, the street art, the freedom from responsibility. Then I thought about Mrs. Henderson's tears of gratitude, about our employees who now had better benefits, about the kids who would learn to skate in our new developments. No regrets, I said. But I am keeping my skateboard in the office, Dad laughed. I'd be disappointed if you didn't. That evening I met the team at our usual spot, Rosa's kitchen table, now covered with business plans instead of criminal evidence. So what's next? Jake asked, reviewing our quarterly projections on his laptop. We're breaking ground on the Austin project next month, I said. Sustainable housing, integrated community spaces, and yes, Jake, a skate park designed by professionals. And the Dallas Art District expansion? Mel asked. City Council approved it yesterday? We're partnering with local artists for every building facade. Rosa smiled from her stove where she was making coffee. Mio, your father must be so proud. I think he is. But more importantly, I'm proud of us. All of us. I looked around at these three people who'd helped me transform from family disappointment to family leader. We'd started as strangers united by a sense of justice. Now we were colleagues, friends, family. You know what the best part is, I said. Brandon thought he was saving the company from Dad's outdated methods. Turns out he was saving it for something better. 1 year later, I stood in the boardroom of Thompson Industries, looking out at the Dallas skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. The same view Dad had stared at for 30 years, but everything else had changed. The quarterly board meeting had just ended. Revenue was up 35%. Employee satisfaction scores were the highest in company history, and we'd won 3 awards for sustainable development practices. More importantly, we'd maintained the victim compensation fund that had helped 127 families recover from Brandon's schemes. Dad knocked on the door and entered with 2 cups of coffee, a ritual we'd developed over the past year. How does it feel? He asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. Different than I expected. Harder in some ways, easier in others. Any second thoughts about leaving your old life behind? I gestured toward the corner of the office where my skateboard leaned against a custom-built rack. Next to it hung 3 of my paintings, the cityscape series I'd been working on when this whole journey started. I didn't leave it behind. I brought it with me, Dad smiled. The Austin project groundbreaking is next week. You nervous? Excited. It's the first development that's completely my vision from the ground up. I pulled up the architectural plans on my computer. Affordable housing integrated with artist studios, community gardens, and recreational spaces. Everything I wished I'd had growing up. Your mother would have loved this, Dad said quietly. Mom had passed away when I was 15. Cancer, quick and merciless. She'd been the one who encouraged my art, who told me creativity was just as valuable as business success. Dad had never talked about her much after she died, throwing himself into work instead of grief. She believed in you long before I did, he continued. She used to tell me that your artistic eye would be valuable in business someday. I thought she was just being optimistic. Maybe she was right about a lot of things. Dad reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick envelope. Speaking of being right about things, I have something for you. Inside were legal documents transferring full ownership of Thompson Industries to me. Not as CEO, but as owner. Dad, you can and you will. This company belongs to you now. You saved it. You've transformed it. You've made it better than I ever could have. He stood up and walked to the window. Besides, I'm 74 years old. It's time I learned to trust the next generation. What about Brandon? We hadn't talked about my brother much over the past year. He was serving his sentence at a federal facility in Colorado, and Dad had visited him exactly once. Brandon made his choices. He thought success meant taking what he wanted instead of earning what he deserved. Dad turned back to me. You chose differently. That evening, I met Jake and Rosa at Mel's house for our weekly dinner. It had become a tradition, the 4 of us gathering to share food, stories, and the kind of friendship that emerges from shared purpose. So you're officially a millionaire now, Jake said, raising his beer in a mock toast. We're all millionaires now, I corrected. The profit-sharing program kicks in for everyone next quarter, Rosa laughed. Mijo, when I agreed to help you investigate your brother, I never imagined I'd end up with a retirement plan this good. When I agreed to help, I thought we'd all end up in federal prison, Mel added. This outcome is much better. What's the plan for tomorrow? Jake asked. He'd been managing the technology integration for all our developments, turning Thompson Industries into one of the most digitally advanced real estate companies in Texas. Meeting with the mayor about the downtown revitalization project. Then the youth center groundbreaking at 3 p.m. The youth center had been my personal project, a place where kids could learn everything from skateboarding to computer programming to financial literacy. Mel was designing legal education workshops. Rosa was teaching basic accounting. Jake was running coding camps. And Friday? Rosa asked. Prison visit, they all looked up. I'd never mentioned visiting Brandon before. You sure about that? Mel asked carefully. I need to. Not for him, but for me. This whole thing started because I wanted to prove Dad's innocence. But it became about something bigger. Understanding what family really means. The next Friday, I drove 3 hours to the federal facility where Brandon was serving his sentence. He looked older, thinner, and somehow smaller than I remembered. The confidence that had defined him was completely gone. Tyler. He sat across from me in the visiting room, separated by bulletproof glass. I didn't think you'd come. I almost didn't. How's the company? Growing, changing, better. Brandon nodded slowly. I heard about the Victim Compensation Fund. That was the right thing to do. It was Dad's idea. Dad's generous. You're the one who implemented it. He looked down at his hands. Tyler, I need to tell you something. I was wrong about you. About everything? I know. No, you don't understand. I was jealous of you. Your whole life you were free to be yourself while I was trapped trying to be perfect. You could fail without disappointing anyone because nobody expected anything from you. I stared at my brother, seeing him clearly for the first time. I spent my whole life trying to live up to an impossible standard, he continued. You just lived. And when it mattered, when everything fell apart, you were the one who fought for what was right. Brandon, I destroyed our family because I thought success meant winning. You saved our family because you understood success means doing what's right. When I left the prison that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't expected, peace. 6 months later, I stood at the podium in the Dallas Convention Center, accepting the Texas Business Leader of the Year award. Dad sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Mel, Jake, and Rosa were at our company table, applauding loudly. This award doesn't belong to me, I said into the microphone. It belongs to everyone who believes that business can be a force for good. It belongs to the employees who trust leadership to do right by them. It belongs to the communities we serve. I paused, looking out at the audience of executives, politicians, and business leaders. A year ago, I was a 32-year-old skateboarder living in a studio apartment, considered the failure of my family. Today, I run a company worth $200 million. That transformation didn't happen because I changed who I was. It happened because I finally understood who I'd always been. The son my father rejected became the son he needed. The brother who was underestimated became the leader who could rebuild what was broken. Sometimes the person everyone writes off is exactly the person who can save everything. After the ceremony, Dad and I stood outside the convention center, watching the Dallas skyline light up against the night sky. Any regrets now? He asked. Just one. What's that? That it took us so long to have this conversation. Dad smiled and put his arm around my shoulders. Tyler, some things are worth waiting for. As we walked toward our cars, I realized something that would have shocked me 2 years ago. I was exactly where I belonged.